Okay. Today, I hope to finish the book of Ezekiel. We have a ways to go still, and a lot of it is going to be some very, very, very dry reading. But I am hoping today to finish the book of Ezekiel and finally get all these long prophet books done and over with. Now, last time I did this has been Thanksgiving week, so it's been difficult to get around to this the last several days. Last time I did this, a week ago or so, I recorded up through Ezekiel 39. Unfortunately, due to distractions, I did not properly close out of my last video session. So the last video I made about Ezekiel 38 and 39, prophecy against Gog and Magog, did not save. And I'm going to have to do that one again. So I'm going to have to do Ezekiel 38 and 39 again, and then I'm hoping to also be able to do Ezekiel 40 to 48 and finish off the book of Ezekiel. That's going to be a lot of reading. So I'm not, if you may be able to tell it in my voice, I've been kind of congested for a while, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this all, but that's the idea, that's the plan. If I didn't have to do 38 and 39 again, I'd probably be able to get through the rest in one day, but I do have to do 38 and 39 again because I messed up last time. Okay, before I begin 38, again, remember, to me this is kind of awkward because I've already done this. Like I said, I didn't save the file properly and lost it, so I had to do it again. Okay, so we are in the part of Ezekiel, the back half of Ezekiel, where he talks about the future instead of the present or the past. He had been spending the first half of Ezekiel was all about the sins that they've committed. There was a reference, there was an element of talking about past sins, the sins the fathers committed, but there was a lot of emphasis on the people's own sins. Yes, their fathers did commit sins, but the people themselves in this day and time, Ezekiel's day and time, were committing their own sins too. They couldn't just blame their fathers for their sins while they were still committing many of those same sins. And they're judged for those. The punishment has happened. We read about that. And Ezekiel has gotten word now in Ezekiel 33 that a messenger has come into the city has fallen. And the people in Babylon, Ezekiel of course is in Babylon, they know it now, the city has fallen. They never thought it would happen, even to the bitter end. Even the people in Jerusalem or the people in Babylon. All the way up to the bitter end, they never thought that would happen, but it did. And so now it's time to turn our attention to the future, and we read about that. We read about in Ezekiel 37, the Valley of Dry Bones, okay, about how God is going to bring the nation back to life, and that was that was a figurative image about God's dealing with the nation as a whole, and that this is not the end of the nation. The nation of Israel is not going to die here. But it was also the clearest and the strongest example yet of God demonstrating his power over death. Now again, not in the sense he's literally going to resurrect these people and bring them back to life per se, but that he's going to call the nation back from death and live in the land again. And that also translates into God's ability to call back those who have died, and he's going to do that someday. And now we move on to Ezekiel 38 and 39. And this takes place in the vision after 37. So 37 is about the nation being brought back and being united again. In the second half of chapter 37, God had Ezekiel join us two separate sticks together, each of them labeled with the different names of the nations of Israel and Judah, north and south, into one, and they representing they're going to be one nation again with one king. So now the prophecy that we're going to be, the vision that we're going to be reading about in 38 and 39 is about a time after that. And I've said before, and we'll have to keep this in mind all throughout the second half of Ezekiel, these prophets, when they look to the future and they prophesy to the people about this great and glorious future awaiting Israel, they're painting this picture of this magnificent, bountiful kingdom. And they're combining like several different things into this imagery These visions of this imagery are going to be fulfilled at different times in the course of history. Some of it refers to the physical return from exile, which happened in the second half of the 500s of BC and following. We'll read about that when we get down to Ezra and Haggai and Zechariah and places like that. Some of it refers to the arrival of the coming king, that'd be Jesus, the Messiah. Some of it refers to the establishment of his kingdom, which those are separate things, okay? Those are separate things. You have the king who comes and then the kingdom that's established, all right? That actually today manifests in the church, a spiritual kingdom on earth today. And some of it also does look ahead to when God consummates the kingdom, and that still hasn't happened to this day. That would be what we call the return of Christ, when all evil is judged and thrown into the fire, and creation itself is cleansed and freed of the curse. And there is no more death. There is no more curse. That hasn't happened to this day. Okay? And sometimes the prophets do extend that far into the future. We saw at the end of Isaiah, a little bit in Jeremiah, not a whole heck of a lot. And we're going to see it a lot here, actually, in Ezekiel. To understand some of the, you have to remember also that these prophets didn't know what they were talking about. Jesus says this in the Gospels, that the prophets themselves, the visions they saw and the messages they spoke, the words that God put in their mouth to speak, that they didn't necessarily make sense to them. They didn't know what these things meant. When God showed them these visions and put these words in their mouths to say to the people and then to write it down later for generations to come afterwards, they didn't know what that meant. They were looking into that too. They wanted to see these things fulfilled too. They didn't get a chance to in their lives. They died before it happened. But they wanted to know what these things meant too, because they didn't know. So when Ezekiel is painting this picture of this great and glorious future kingdom, he doesn't really know what that means. He probably takes it to mean pretty much the same thing that everybody else would take it to mean, that they're going to live in this kingdom. And they're going to have, villages without walls, and they're going to be living in peace and security in this kingdom. But that isn't necessarily fulfilled in the sense that it literally happened in that promised land in the course of history. And I know this because at the end of Revelation, which is the last book in the Bible, I think also it's the last one in our Bibles. It's the last one at the end of the book that we have arranged today. And I believe it was the last one to be written. And we see this summary, this summation of the entire scope of God's plan from beginning to end throughout history. And we know at the end of the book of Revelation that some of these things are still to come. Death has not yet been defeated. I mean, we can be confident that we're going to be raised again someday because Christ was. But people are still dying. The curse on the ground is still in effect. Creation is still marred by the effects of sin and the curse. That hasn't been done away with. The power of death has been broken, but death itself, people still die, animals still die. The curse has not been lifted yet. That won't happen until the end of Revelation. And some of these visions in Isaiah and Ezekiel, John in Revelation matches up with those, and we know that they're looking towards the future. That has not yet been fulfilled even to this day. So that's just important to keep in mind, not only for this next two chapters in this vision against Gog and Magog, but also for everything else in the book of Ezekiel. Everything from now until the end of the book of Ezekiel is looking forward to a point in time down the road that hasn't happened yet, even to this day. And I don't believe that this means that chapters 38 to 48 are going to happen literally or physically. I don't believe there's actually going to be a physical invasion of an army of Gog's allies against the land of Israel. I don't believe that the temple that's going to be described in chapters 40 and following is ever going to be literally built. It wasn't literally built in history. I don't believe it's going to be literally built in history. To fully understand this section, we are going to have to skip ahead to the book of Revelation at the end of the Bible, because we cannot fully grasp what Ezekiel is saying here without getting the New Testament interpretation of this. So we're going to have to do that a few times as we read through this section. Let me go ahead and start a new video. That was all preparation. That was all setting the stage for this last 11 chapters of the book of Ezekiel. And like I said, I did the first couple of these chapters last week, but I messed up saving the video, so I have to do it again. So this video is all about setting the stage for some of the things we need to know in order to understand the last part of Ezekiel properly. He is speaking of the future. He's speaking of a great and glorious kingdom that to the Jews living in Babylon at this time, they could only see it as them being back in their land, raising their crops and having their families and safety in the land with the king ruling over them. That's not going to be fulfilled in that literal way. It didn't happen in history. It's not going to happen throughout the rest of history. The temple in Ezekiel 40 to 48 was never literally built, and it is not ever going to be literally built. The invasion of Gog and Magog here in 38 and 39 has not happened. It will not ever literally happen. But the vision, it speaks of a time when the kingdom is great and glorious, and some of this still awaits fulfillment, and we're going to have to turn to the book of Revelation to get a sense of that. Because remember, Ezekiel didn't know this. Ezekiel was writing his book in the 570s BC, maybe. Or he had his visions then, maybe wrote down a little bit later. John comes along in Revelation and seals up vision and prophecy and sums it all up at about the year 100 AD, so 600 or so years later. Okay, so Ezekiel didn't have the full revelation. So we can't depend on Ezekiel to tell us how everything is going to be exactly, because he didn't know the full story of what God had in mind. Okay, here we go. Stop.